So, Trix, if I can begin with you after
Sure.
seeing the play there. So, can you just give us an idea of how it came to be commissioned? And I noticed that you won the debut play award at Channel 4 for it. Can you tell us a little bit about that scheme and how they brought on new talent and whether we can learn anything about that scheme that was running in 1984 today?
It's interesting. I think going back to that scheme, I think that they should still run a scheme like that. They didn't. What was difficult about winning that award was the fact that I got paid for it, but there was no guarantee that they were going to screen it. So I just kicked up enough fuss, and I said, so what's the point of having this sodding competition if I, as a writer for theatre, wins this award and you're not even going to show it? And the reason they didn't want to show it was because single drama cost so much money. So in the end, we really took them to task about it. So begrudgingly, they did it. When I did the play, I did it at the Albany Empire initially, and we did it in real time. It was set on Bonfires Night, and at the time when people went robbing, then they nicked videos because they could see the flashing light. And when people went to watch a fireworks display in Peckham Rye, a lot of houses were emptied, and so they had a field day there. And elements of that were missing, actually. And by the end of the play, what we also did was to have all the characters right at the end in the original play. The police did come in and arrest it, but they were really sort of strong-armed in the way that arrested him. And so we had the guy that played the policeman came out, and all the other characters came out in character and did a Q&A with the audience, and which was really interesting, especially the young guy that played the policeman. How it came about was I knew about this competition, but I didn't apply for it. It was one of the members of the cast that applied for it. And when they rang me at home to say, congratulations, you won it, I thought he was joking, so I put the phone down. and so, no, they rang back and said, no, you've actually won this competition. Channel 4 was set up in the ethos of actually having multiracial production companies, etc., and trying to champion various new voices. And they've recently had their asses slapped again because of that, because they've gone so far away from that, and they're only sort of really champion bigger production companies like Endemol to make programming. So now they're thinking of going back to that. I still think that, having a broadcaster run a writers' competition for new voices is really significant because it is so difficult to get in. When I was writing Desmond's, I've often said this, by the time I finished writing Desmond's, that, I was the writer, the black writer for television at the time, and if I wasn't doing it, then I probably wouldn't become a professional writer because there were just so few chances. There still are. So in terms of, to answer your question, yeah, I do think that they should continue doing something like that, and not just these writers' rooms which seem to lead nowhere. And it just feels like they're ticking boxes, and what writers really want is experience. They want their voices to be heard. They want to be part of a team. They need to know how to write half hour, an hour. And so, yeah, I think, going back to it, yeah, I do think there should be more of those things.
And watching it there again, what struck me is how modern that theme of the disconnection that Barrington feels between himself and the rest of society is. The idea that, no matter how much education he gets, he'll always be excluded. And that's, I just wanted, is it almost a little bit depressing for you sitting here now and seeing, well, actually, not that much has changed, and it still is so relevant watching it again.
Well, it is, and unfortunately, I'm a father, and I have two grown-up sons, and seeing them grow up and see how little access they've had, and they've been really ingenious in the way that they tried to get access to television, and by crowdfunding and using the internet, and and Facebook, and then there's these guys here who have done incredibly well. But yeah, I think, the disconnect is certainly there, and I think it goes right across the board now. It's not just amongst black families too, but it's a migrant story. It was a Windrush story that, and I'm sort of looking back on it and seeing it again for the first time, reminded how much of a Windrush story it was and is, and that as a theme has been sort of constant in my life of writing sort of Windrush-based stories, from For Queen and Country to Desmond's to this. Yeah, the disconnect is still there, still really, really painful. So watching it was painful, actually.
And that idea of being caught
Yeah.
between two cultures,
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So yeah, and these guys who are watching it said, "Oh my God, you know, that's so relevant now." So
Yeah, no,
maybe you
definitely.
should
I was going
them
to
the
ask
question.
actually, as you were watching it, did you feel, well, this is not a million miles away from the stuff that we're writing
No,
about
yeah.
now in Save Me?
Well, yeah, and probably more to do with the personal experience with our parents' generation, because I think when that came out, we were probably only like 5 or 6, so it wouldn't have been of Gary's generation, but growing up in the 90s, there was a lot of the stuff he was saying were very much things that we've experienced individually and you know with our parents. So yeah, and yeah, in terms of like what we write about, we always have like otherness in some way is always part of our writing, in whether it's directly about being other or it's done in say like more different ways. Like so, you know, we've written science fiction, and so you could talk about otherness within genre as well. But the fact that we've grown up, you know, being different to most people around us in society is definitely something that infects our work, and I think always will. And so yeah, so those themes are incredibly relevant to us, and I think to a younger generation.
The other thing, Trix, I wanted to say was how brilliantly you cope with the two of them starting at loggerheads, and then this wonderful, really quite touching relationship that develops between them as the play goes on. And I wondered, was that idea of the idea that the bonds that bind them are actually much stronger than those that divide them? Was that very much your starting point for the play?
Yeah, that was
in a
my
way?
starting point, and also the fact of growing up as a kid that we really respected elderly people. You know, that was the generation that did. And it was certainly a generation where you didn't, you know, where young thieves and muggers and whatever didn't steal from their own. They just didn't steal from black people. So when you saw young black muggers, they certainly didn't do that. And also, for me, the premise for me was to have this conversation between the two generations about, you know, yes, you came here, yes, you had this very idealistic notion of what being in England would be about, but actually we, the kids, were the ones that was living it. We were out there in the playground, on the street. So I really wanted that conversation to take place, and that's where I started. That was my starting point with it. And I think, you know, now we still have to have conversations about, you know, about cultural identity and integration and how we feel within this union.
And a shout out for Mona Hammond.
And Mona, oh my God. Yeah, Mona and Carmen were the two actresses that I've always wanted to work with. And it's interesting, whenever I write a piece, producer will say to me, you know, so who have you got in mind? I never have anybody in mind because, you know, for me then it sort of corrupts the character that I'm trying to create because I'll have their voice in mind. But I've always, you know, championed the thing of I really want to work with Mona Hammond and indeed Carmen Monroe, and I got a chance to do both of that in Just Like Mohicans and Desmond's. In fact, Mona was in Desmond's too.
Yeah, we managed to work with Mona on our show Run. She played Lenny James's mum.
Oh, wow.
In the show as well, so we got to meet and work with her. She was really cool. Yeah, so
She is, isn't she?
Yeah. Well, congratulations. It's a gem of a play. I'm really
Thank
glad
you.
we've managed to dust it off and get it out of the archives.
Thank you.
Which brings me to Stephen, whose work that's been. And Stephen, if I can ask you a bit of a wider question about the whole season and what motivated you to put this season of Forgotten Black television drama together.
Thank you. I'll go back to the beginning. I come from a working class family. And in the 1960s, I watched everything on television because I later discovered in life that middle class people were only allowed 1 hour on a Sunday. But working class kids could watch television in the 60s and so on. And I watched everything from Blue Peter to Ken Loach's Cathy Come Home. So at a very young, impressionable age, I was conscious that British television was amazing and was doing great things. I'm now still of the opinion, and it's my personal opinion, that television is still considered the poor relation to film, in spite of the wonderful work done by Royal Holloway University on forgotten television drama seasons that they've done here. And so becoming more and more familiar with British television history, I realised when I became more involved in race and representation and looking at that subject, what wonderful work was being done as early as the 1950s. Very rare opportunities for black writers at that time, but they were doing this work. And when you compare British television to British cinema, there were no black writers in British cinema until at least the 1970s, and even then, only in independent cinema, like Horace Survey's Pressure. And so when I started doing this research in the 1980s, and I've continued doing black British history work, not just television, what motivates me is this. The conclusions I've come to at this later stage in my life is that we can talk about Windrush scandal and all the terrible things that have happened to the black community in this country. We all have examples, we've all had experiences that we've been exposed to. That's part of the narrative, but it's not the whole story. There is another narrative that we don't highlight, and that's what I call the positive narrative. The great things that black people have achieved in this country that are not being taught to the younger generation. They hear about the African Americans in schools and academies, but they don't hear about the great things that black people have done in this country. And so when you take television and you look at the work of Jan Carew and his wife Sylvia Winter at Next Sunday, Double Bill, The Big Pride and Day of the Fox, and you look at the work of Barry Record and Mustafa Matura and all those, Buki Emechita, all these wonderful writers contributing to television, British television, when the perception has always been it's just black and white minstrels and nothing else. Mm-hmm. We've got to move away from that. We've got to start reclaiming the past and re-examining it, and to rediscover Trix's play and to open the season with Trix's play is wonderful for me because it validates everything I've been searching for and trying to do over the last 30-odd years. It's a wonderful play, and it's wonderful performances, not just by Mona, who is a legend, but Gary Beadle as well. Yeah. It's almost like a two-hander, and I'm so glad it survived. Some things haven't survived. You may want to ask me a question later about that, but we can only go with what has survived in the archives.
Well, if we just look at some of the plays coming up in the season and try to relate them a little bit to what's going on now. So you mentioned The Day of the Fox, which is a fascinating play with Sammy Davis Jr. playing this disillusioned revolutionary, trying to destroy the remnants of white colonial rule in an African state. It's really quite radical stuff. And of course, it went out on ITV in 1961.
Only 2 channels.
Yeah.
BBC and ITV.
And of course, we've just had Hugo Blick's series, which is the first thing that I can remember for a long time, attempting to look at the whole issue of Western colonialism and the impact that's had on Africa. You can make a strong argument now that colonialism's an end, but are we now in a phase where the multinationals and the business pressures on Africa have taken over for where colonialism left off? And it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be, apart from Hugo Blick's series, there doesn't seem to be those big radical issues coming through on television, and I just, and particularly from black writers, and I just wondered what you felt about that, guys. Whether you feel it's
I would probably say there's many in development, so it's not so much that they're not being created or there isn't a want to get them onto TV. It's more whether or not they'll actually be, made and put on the screen, and so. We've come a long way, I think Marlon and I feel, in recent years in terms of there's a lot more screenwriters in television who are from diverse backgrounds, but the decision makers, the people who ultimately spend the money for it to go onto the screen, there's still there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, we would argue.
Kind of feels like we're in the kind of like the box set kind of generation thing where people want to binge and knock out like a series like in a day or two. And so the people that are making the decisions are looking at projects that can be easily kind of consumed. And those more challenging projects, we know personally they are there, but sometimes it just takes a little bit more of oomph to get them onto screen. Maybe it's because there's a star, a name, someone who cares passionately about that particular subject, and that will, expedite things really quickly. In the case of Hugo Blick, he's had a few series behind him which are in a similar kind of vein of Black Earth Rising. So I think it made it a lot easier for a commissioner to say, okay, let's tell this story.
And Lenny James, of course, with Save Me, coming on board, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that was Sky wanted to work on a show with him. Like, they wanted to do a show with him, so that was his opportunity to. That character is very much based on his older brother. It's very, we'd probably call it semi-autobiographical. Luckily, his brother's daughter wasn't kidnapped, but the kind of character he is and the life that he was showing was something very true to his experience and to ours in different ways. It definitely helps if you have someone who's recognizable to get these projects going. But just in terms of specific to projects that are maybe slightly more political and radical, and in those that are going to look at how colonialism was and still is a massive problem on the African continent. They're there, they're just not getting made. Is probably the most succinct answer to that question.
Yeah, I find in my experience, I've been working with the BBC of late, and even when you come in with your project and it might be the most relevant, you don't know what their agenda is.
Yeah, they have business considerations.
Yeah, they have business considerations, and for me, what I didn't know was the fact that they're losing a young audience hand over fist, and so that's what they're chasing. They're chasing this thing. We've got to have a young writer. It's got to be young. It's got to be young, and so I didn't know that going in, and so for a young market, it has to be much more consumable. Do they take on? Yeah. And this is second guessing the young market. That I'm sure if you presented something with a great characters, they'll consume it like everybody else. But
I'm not so sure. I mean, forgive me for mentioning my book Black Poppies. I did a book called Black Poppies 4 or 5 years ago on the black servicemen in the First World War, and this was picked up by a young black actor who came to me and took me to a commission, an independent company, and he loved it. The guy there, the young black actor wanted to do a comedy drama, a kind of clever one, based on the stories in the book about the black troops in the First World War on the front line, a sort of Blackadder-ish type of thing. And the company picked it up and said, yes, we'll take it to the BBC. Because the point being, the young black actor said, I don't mind going to America for auditions and getting parts in America, because this is what has happened to the younger generation of black actors.
Yeah, sure.
They get the work over there. The BBC, nah. Sky, nah. Channel 4, nah. They wouldn't even consider the proposal, to development money work. I don't work in television, so I just assume it's development. And I felt so sad because this guy had found a story that related to his experience as a young black British guy, a young black British actor, and not one television company in this country would pick it up. So I haven't heard anything for a year now, but I wish the young actor luck.
Yeah,
he's probably in America, bless him. Yeah,
more than likely. Yeah, the gatekeepers are where we feel more work could be done, and over time, hopefully that will happen. But yeah, the diversity is needed there.
We'll come on to that actually.
Sorry.
a little bit later. Just want to stick with the season before we move on to wider questions. So both you in your small corner, the Barry Record Play, and Club Havana. They're both very much about the theme of interracial relationships.
Yeah.
And of course, we must take into account the changes in society that have happened since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I just wondered, Stephen, if you wanted to say anything about what that tells us about the society that Barry Record was writing in.
I'm glad you've asked that question, because what struck me looking closely at this work, that thematically in the 60s and 70s, you've already mentioned decolonisation, the breakdown of empire, independence, which is picked up in Day of the Fox, interracial relationships, was very much the preoccupation of Barry Record, I would say. He seemed to be very interested in that, and that was very kind of the time. That's why a lot of people make a big deal out of Uhura and Captain, not Spock, the other Kirk. I've watched television 60s, forgotten him. So that was very much a dominant theme, and you're right, we do have to look at it in that context. It's not so much a dominant theme now, but it was then. But also the settlement of the African-Caribbean generation post-Windrush. Some call it the Windrush generation. Some black friends of mine tell me off, don't call it the Windrush generation. You know, we were here. Anyway, but that comes over very strongly in one of the plays in the season, Blackfeet in the Snow, Jamal Ali's play, kind of almost like a drama documentary, and very innovative for its time, 1974, and certainly one of my favourites, which I had to have in the season, which was Norman Beaton, a monologue in Mustafa Matura's Nice. It's really wonderful. If you come to see anything in the season, please come and see Norman Beaton doing a monologue in this Mustafa Matura play at the end with the hope and the glory. It's wonderful. So those were the kind of dominant themes that black writers, by and large, with some exceptions. I must just very briefly mention, Marcus, one writer that's not represented, the great Trinidadian Errol John. He wrote 2 original dramas for BBC television in the 1960s, but sadly, as some of you will know, a lot of television, British television, has been lost. But you can access the scripts. If you pay the BBC Archives a fee, they will send you the script. So I do have the script of The Exiles, an original drama that he did in 1969. It's really for the Wednesday play.
And I guess the other big theme that's going to come out across the season is that of discrimination. I mean, in the sense of both the museum attendant and the juju landlord.
Oh, absolutely.
Quite brutal and naked discrimination. And
not necessarily white against black.
No,
as in
of
the
course
Juju landlord.
Buki
Emechita is exploring that discrimination within her own community.
Yeah.
So, and the tensions there in Crown Court, which was a daytime television. I used to bunk off school to watch this stuff. Emmerdale Farm, Crown Court, all these things in the afternoon. It was worth bunking off school for. But they were doing this kind of stuff on afternoon television. Extraordinary.
But I want to ask these guys, some people would perhaps argue that unlike the 60s, 70s and 80s, discrimination is a little more hidden, it's a little more subtle, although you may disagree with that. Is it important for this generation to find a new way of writing about the subject of discrimination, do you think, that is about discrimination here and now? Because obviously these plays are very much on the nose about discrimination in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but is there a new voice that needs to be found to articulate it now?
Well, I think maybe not so much about having to find a new voice. I think it will naturally be new because it is about, or hypothetically speaking, it would be about their experiences now, as opposed to, assuming that they would write about their experiences. Then I think just by the fact that it's them doing it and that they come from a different era and have a very, or in some cases similar but also very different experience, they are and will by their nature be different and say different things.
I think it kind of harks back to what Daniel was saying before, that maybe it's kind of like the lens of which you're showing it, like which you're bringing. I think sometimes when you're pitching ideas or talking to production companies, they might feel like they've seen something before, but you know, if you were talking about otherness through the lens of a science fiction program, or you know, something that was you know,
So you use a Trojan horse.
yeah, almost a
approach.
Trojan horse approach. You know, if there was and that immediately gives you like a fresh take on it. You know, so I think sometimes it's about being a bit creative with how you come in, you know, with your idea. That might work in this.
Yeah, and I
this
totally
current
agree.
day.
And I think the other thing is that now if you just use it as it is, and let's just tell the story. This is
Yes.
part of what happens in our world, but
Yeah.
actually that's not the main thrust of the story.
Yeah,
We're trying
yeah.
to get
Yeah.
to over there. You know,
No,
this is
yeah.
just life. You know, and since Brexit, you know, my nieces are mixed race. You know, so for the first time they're getting racism since the whole Brexit thing.
Yeah,
So,
there's,
you know, so-
yeah, for sure. It feels like in some pockets of society, it's now become okay to be over with your prejudice or racism, but within the industry, as people who work within it, it's not going to be in the way it was in the past. It's a lot more insidious, but. Or hidden, should we say? But or very well-meaning. You know, there's you know, people could be very well-meaning, but not realise that they're actually being discriminatory at the same time. So it's it's quite diversified in that respect.
In the
How, but yeah, I overall, it feels like there are new ways to talk about very similar themes that are a part of this season for this new generation of writers, that's for sure.
I mean, Trix, if you were writing that play again now, it's a difficult question, but would you approach it differently or exactly the same?
I think I'd approach it the same, but the difference would be it would just have a bit more of a lick to it. It would have much more of a rhythm. It certainly feels like the way it's staged and the way the pacing of it was of its time. It's a bit like I remember watching Widows, which is one of my favourite TV shows ever, and watching the original one before I went to see the new one, and how much quicker. I know they had to condense it in half an hour, in an hour and a half, but drama back then was just a lot slower. Drama now is such a lick, and there's so much storytelling is it's exposed and moved on, and maybe
because there's so much
episode.
because there is so
Yeah.
much out there. You kind of have to justify it. Like, it's almost like, why am I watching this as
Sure.
an audience member? You know,
Sure.
what's keeping me here? Because there are like 15 other stations
And equally, I think, if
And a
we were doing
remote
it now, it'd
control.
probably be a bit much more violent. It would have
Right.
been much more violent. I think would have taken it to an edge.
Do you think that's because society's become more violent, or because you would have dramatically wanted it to be
No,
more
I think
violent?
because society has, and also because the images that we see on television are so if it, it was an adaptation from a stage play. So if it was an original screenplay, it would have been completely different.
That brings us quite nicely talking about the here and now to Save Me, starring Lenny James and Saran Jones for Sky Atlantic. Written with Lenny James by our panellists Marlon and Daniel. It became the most rapidly binged box set in the broadcaster's history, with 700,000 watching the entire series in its first week alone. So congratulations, guys. So you really managed in that series to create a really sort of authentic working class world and characters without patronising them at all. And I just wondered how important that was to the whole concept, especially when there's so few contemporary series on television now that actually deal with that working class world irrespective of race in a really sort of authentic way.
Yeah, I think it's because so we almost got the job because of what had happened with Ryan, and we'd worked so well with Lenny, and this kind of Save Me is so personal to him. Like Dan said, some of the characters are based on real people, and I think there are a lot of shows about working class people where it's about drugs and crime and so on, and we all know there's you know, growing up working class, there are there's some dark alleys, there's some dark things that happen, but there's also some good times, you know. There's some fun times and fun characters, and I think with Save Me, Lenny was just interested in showing the other side of it, you know, and I think what made it very kind of attractive to audiences was that there were characters who they could have a good time with, that they were familiar with, but then there was also this kind of genre kind of thread that was placed in the middle of it, which kept you hooked and kept you going. But I think it was just, he was very eager from the start, as were we, that no one would do anything that was kind of just to keep plot going. You know, everyone would be living their lives, and I think audiences reacted to that. I think they could see this is authentic. You know, these people have grown up kind of in this world, and he's not trying to, you know, patronize us or throw some kind of weird, you know, plot device in there that no one would ever do, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. One of the, I guess, mantras that was developed over time was to have complex characters but not complex plot, because, like Marlon was saying, it was really important that the characters and the lives that they were living were as real as possible, and in real life, it's really people that are complicated. So we kind of carried that all the way through for the episode that we wrote for the show, and then Lenny obviously kept that going for his as well, and it's the same going into the second series. It's always remembering to, you know, if there's a situation, how's that character going to react? Think about it, not necessarily for like, which is sometimes a natural thing to do as a writer. What's the most dramatic and most like all-out kind of response you could get, so you can have your audience lean forward and come back for the next episode. Sometimes it's more important to think, well, how would that particular character that we've created, who's based on people in real life, how would they really react? And then from that you get, we feel, better results for a show like that. You know, if you're, it's very specific to that kind of show. So yeah.
And one of the things we noticed from watching the older archive plays compared to Save Me is that you haven't made race an issue as such in the series. It's organically baked into there, and we see everything from Lenny's point of view, and it's just about surviving as everybody else around him is trying to survive.
That I think the focus of the show is more on Lenny's character as a failed father, and so that's probably what you're responding to there. I mean, him being black and his daughter being mixed race and going missing are definitely when it comes to certain situations, it's definitely going to feed into the story. But for Lenny, we wanted to more focus on this guy as an individual, and as in particular as a failed father, and how that changes him over the period of which he's searching for his daughter.
I wanted to ask you all about what you felt the future holds for black drama, and of course we can't only just talk about TV anymore, because we have there's two things in a world of Netflix and Amazon. Young people are consuming drama from all over the world. So the first part of my question is, do you feel that as writers you need to keep your stories specific to the communities that you know, within the country that you know, or should it be more global? And the second part of the question is, with new digital opportunities on Vice and YouTube and all those other ways of getting your work seen, what are the opportunities for black voices to be heard on those new digital channels, and will that affect the type of stories that are being told, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the new platforms certainly do, because I've come across writers now who can write really well within 10 minutes, but you give them half an hour and they struggle. With the new platform, I always, whenever I'm lecturing, I tell students, you know, who's got a mobile phone, they'll stick their hand up. Who's got a laptop? Yeah. So why aren't you making films then? You know, so for me now, you know, in terms of black voices, yeah, we should arrest the internet and make it our own and give ourselves our voices and put stuff out there if we're not getting access. You know, I strongly believe that. And out of that, we can actually forge a new language, a new viewing figure, the way that, you know, maybe 15 minutes is the way to go forward instead of half an hour or an hour. But I think, you know, we should experiment with it more. It's a perfect opportunity to do that. And when I first started, you know, it was, you know, 8mm film and 16mm and cost money and all that, and then videotape turned up and all these things. But now, you know, you do have a smartphone with a decent camera on it, and most people got a laptop, they can make a film.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question? Is that happening in film schools, do you think?
That is beginning to happen in film school too, yeah. I mean, I know at the National they're certainly going for stuff like that.
Encouraging students to use
to encouraging
that,
students to do that. And
Yeah.
And I've got a friend here who actually lectures on film and stuff, so maybe we should ask her the question a bit later on.
Do you think you always hit a ceiling with your work on those platforms, though, where ultimately you need to go to the traditional gatekeepers, ITV, BBC, Channel 4, to get your work seen on a wider platform?
No, but also the other thing is with that means that you can actually then go to BBC and ITV and say, look, we shot this.
Yeah.
You know, this is what we're trying to achieve here. Give us more money, we can make it even better.
Yeah, I think that's kind of
You know.
kind of what we did with Run, and I think a lot of actors now and a lot of writers who are writing on shows and are part of writers' rooms, I think, particularly if they are black or ethnic or any kind of ethnic minority as well, they have actually started doing their own stuff first, and it's almost like it's created such a wave or created so much attention that a lot of the time broadcasters are kind of coming looking for them, you know, or saying to them, well, here's an opportunity. I think BBC Three have done quite a lot of stuff like that.
And they have,
They've given a few opportunities to people who have really blown up on the internet, on
People do
YouTube
nothing,
and stuff like that. People do nothing, and the guy who did Roll Safe, Enterprise,
Enterprise,
those kind of things. So yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of like there's almost no excuse now. You know, you go out and make your own stuff. I also think as well that the real kind of changes, which are going to be slow, but they will happen when there are more people in development who are, you know, ethnic minorities. You know, that it's still quite rare. I think when me and Dan started, it was almost non-existent. You know, the people who you're pitching your ideas to, and now there is a bit of a change. But I think having to kind of shoehorn your ideas into what you think might be acceptable or someone might go for is a problem for a writer. I think when you can go in and be free to tell the story, to pitch the idea that you want to pitch, and then there's a familiarity there because maybe they might be from a similar background to you, or they might have been through a certain experience where you don't have to dilute your idea. I think that'll be a great time.
I mean,
for
interesting enough, I
writers,
spent almost a whole year with, you know, a very big production company in terms of Hat Trick, trying to second guess what the BBC might want with this particular product would happen to be black. So I spent the whole year and 14 drafts later trying to second guess rather than just going with the notion of what it is and being true to it.
It's splintered off and everyone's kind of in their own, or at least has the potential to be in their own bubble and their own kind of feedback loop and listen to and watch things and read things that just affirm what they already believe. I'm not sure if we'll ever go back to a time when everyone was watching the same channel at the same time. It feels like we're in a new era now, and it's about trying to figure out how we can reach people inside their own bubbles in a different way. How we get people to maybe get into something or watch something or read something that they wouldn't ordinarily watch or read or consume. So it's definitely a challenge, but I think we'll figure that out as time goes on, because where we are now is still fairly new in terms of specific to television anyway, moving into into a multi-platform arena. It's still in its infancy. I don't think that we've seen what its true face will be yet. Maybe give it another 5 to 10 years, and it will start to morph into something a bit more concrete. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add to that? But,
No,
but
I
it's a good
totally
point.
don't. Yeah, it's a really good point. And you know, as you said, we're still in its infancy, and we haven't seen the hand of Amazon or Apple or any of the other big players that are going to come in and burst the whole thing wide open. So
It might go I mean, it might be like when you had different video cassette formats back in the day. You had like Betamax and all these other ones, and ultimately VHS won out. And there was something very similar with like DVDs, and you know, there's all these different formats, and then ultimately something rises to the top, and it could be, you know, we've got so many viewing platforms that in about 10 years' time, possibly half of them may not still be here. It might only be a select few, and that might, in a strange way, bring people back to a situation where we were many years ago, when everyone was kind of watching similar things at the same time. So that's another theory as well, but all very speculative.
We did consider episodes of long-running series. Like, one of my favourite television dramas is Z-Car's A Place of Safety, 1964. John Hopkins, brilliant, genius writer for British television at that time, wrote this incredible episode about an African married to an Asian woman with 2 mixed-race children who are in conflict, and with the police, with their landlord, and it's just stunning. And I would like to have included it, but it had been shown recently. And there's lots of examples like that. There's lots of examples that I've never even seen. Like, there was a Granada series in 1968 called City 68. I did discuss it with Les. He had seen it. So there's still material out there, and we tended to get drawn towards the single play. But we didn't exclude episodes of long-running series either.
for me, growing up, it was more about comedy for some reason. You know, we started to own comedy, and the only time we saw black faces were in comedy, whether we were being the butt end of a joke or we were retaliating. I mean, I'll never forget one evening just watching something like Love Thy Neighbour and laughing and all that, and then thinking, you know, that's all we do comedy. And then at 10 o'clock we watched Trevor McDonald reading the news, and that was really serious. Do you know what I mean? So, but I don't know what happened from those wonderful one-off dramas that suddenly,
I
you know,
asked,
we became,
sorry.
you know, the only time you saw any black faces was in comedy, even, you know, from
There was a
No
period in the
Problems to-
60s where black actors and writers were, not so much writers but some, but black actors were getting good work. And I interviewed a lot of that generation way back, and Carmen Monroe was the one that explained to me that as soon as Enoch Powell made those Rivers of Blood speeches in 1968,
right.
then the work dried up. Then in the 70s you get the sitcoms, the terrible sitcoms. I thought Love Thy Neighbour was awful, even when I was a teenager. I didn't find it funny at all, but it was popular, and it was popular with black audiences because there was nothing else. There were exceptions to the rule, like we're talking about, the plays and the series like Empire Road, but by and large, it was a very problematic decade in terms of race, and a lot of that is blame is to be put down to those dreadful sitcoms that we were exposed to.
And, you know, an alternative, the only other time that I saw black faces on television was in Crown Court, which was a great daytime drama, but, you know...
And not just criminals. We've got Thomas Baptiste as a QC coming up in Buki's Juju Landlord in a couple of weeks.
What did you say about the comedy? Because as I was thinking about it earlier, and like we up until Storm Damage, which had massive impact on me and Daniel, it was literally you had Desmond's, Ron McCoy, and then the BBC would do, I think it was on BBC Two, like on Friday nights, they'd do like from 9 until midnight, there would be like Blouse and Skirt and Brothers and Sisters
Yeah, yeah.
and stuff for like a year or so. But then it all just stopped, you know.
Died away.
Full stop, died away, yeah.
Yeah, really good. That feeds into a little remark I made earlier about how discrimination can actually be well-meaning. Because, you know, we've been in the meetings as well where they want that particular one story, and they mean well because they want to have a drama on TV that is about the black experience, but that black experience will always be about the struggle, really. But to answer specifically your question as to how we get around that, what we, well, first and foremost, who we're talking to and the context, all of that kind of really plays into it. So we will more go or seek out producers or commissioners who have already shown in some way, whether through talking to them or through their work, that they are into doing dramas that aren't typical when it comes to the black experience. Or at least a little bit more open-minded in how they want to work with black writers. So doing a bit of homework there always serves us well, because you have to kind of be on the same page, we feel. And then what we tend to do is try and to engage them just purely on a storytelling basis. Like, so if we pitch to them, we're appealing to their inner audience, their inner reader, and just trying to grab them on things that are universal to everyone. Whether it be excitement or something that's funny or so on and so forth. And once we've kind of hooked them in, then we may explain where our inspirations have come from, and sometimes it might be from our experience of being black and working class. But effectively, we're not leading with that. We're leading with what we feel everyone, no matter where they come from, will be into. Would be into. Sorry. The elements of the story that we feel are universal are what we lead with. And anything after that just further kind of bolsters the idea. It gives it some maybe authenticity or some legs, but what we're really grabbing them with is the initial idea, having made sure that they are people who would be into said ideas, though.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to?
Well said.
I think it's just important. I would say just to do your homework and to just kind of seek out, people that have, just look at what they've made before, what they've been involved in, and that will pretty much give it to you. I think when we first started, a lot of the time when we were eager and young, when we were going to see people, and we would pitch them insanely big ideas, and they'd be like, "Oh, well, we wasn't really expecting that. We was expecting kind of
Top Boy 3,
or Run Again." And I think it's important it's important not to let it knock you back, and just to keep pushing and keep going, and don't give into it, because me and Dan, we've got lots and lots of ideas that we like Top Boy, that are like Top Boy, that we want to tell one day. But then there's 100 other ideas that we want to tell as well, and it's just important to keep pushing with those ones, because someone, eventually you'll make those connections with people where it's kind of like, okay, this will fit this person. Like, I don't have to, chisel in this or that issue to tick a box for them.